here are the top 5 things you should know before becoming a wildlife rehabber. The first one is that you are not going to sit and pet animals all day. A lot of people want to go into rehab because they think that being a rehabber will allow them to have close contact with wild animals on a daily basis. And while that's true, you're actually going to spend a lot less time with those animals than you think you will. For example, unless you're working with an educational program and working with trained animal ambassadors, you really want to minimize the amount of time you're spending with your patients. Think of it this way. Wildlife rehabilitation for animals is kind of like an alien abduction. It's scary, it's weird, and they don't understand what's going on. Those animals are not going to like you, and they're going to try to get away from you at best, or they might try to bite or scratch you if they're really, really scared. One of the things that I always tell people that are interested in this field is to consider the fact that these animals are not going to like you. That's the number one thing that I see people get wrong. In order for your patients to recover, you actually kind of have to take a hands-off approach. The animals that you work with are not going to like you. Regardless of the best animal handling skills that you have, you are going to get bit and scratched at some point. And you're going to have to be okay with that because it's not the animal's fault that it's scared. The other thing to consider is you're actually going to deal a lot with people. A lot of people want to go into rehab because the idea of working with animals all day sounds better, especially if they don't like people. But actually in rehab, you're going to be dealing with people a lot. If you're working at a wildlife hospital or a large rehab organization, you're going to have to work with your coworkers at all different skill levels. And you're also going to have to work with volunteers too. And you're not going to be able to pick and choose which volunteers you get along with and which you don't. So you kind of have to have really good people skills in order to work at a facility like this. And even if you're an independent rehabber that doesn't have any coworkers and you're just doing this on your own, you're still going to probably have to deal with other rehabbers in the community that kind of form the broad partnerships that you have with each other. And more importantly, who's going to be bringing you these animals? It's not the animals themselves, it's the public. If you're not good at people and you scare those people away that are trying to bring you animals, and if you yell at them for something minor that they did wrong, do you think that they're going to bring you an animal again? So my piece of advice is that if you want to work in rehab, you have to respect animal space, and you also have to be at least a little bit willing to work with people or work on your people skills. The second thing that I think that everyone needs to know is that rehab work is really messy and it's really gross. Injured animals, you're going to deal with blood and guts. Baby animals, you're going to have to deal with urine and feces. And recovering animals that may not be badly injured, but they're still recovering, you're still going to have to clean up after them and their food every day. So some animals, like herbivores, they're not too bad to clean up after, at least in terms of the food they leave behind, because it's not that much different from like eating a salad, right? But if you're working with carnivores, you're going to have to be picking up pieces of dead mice, and that meat might have been there for at least 24 hours. So it's not going to be the freshest thing in the world, and it might smell a little bit too. The other thing to consider is that a lot of small animals, especially birds, eat insects. So you're going to have to be dealing with insects like mealworms, waxworms, to provide those animals that are in your care the best care possible. And that means taking care of the insects too. So it's okay if you're a little bit squeamish. Everyone is at first, but it's something to keep in mind that if insects are a big no for you, maybe you should either consider working on that phobia first, or maybe rehab is not for you. And on the really gross end of things, if you're working with injured animals, you're going to be dealing, unfortunately, with fly eggs, maggots, botflies, and all other sorts of parasites too that aren't for the faint of heart. Again, it's pretty easy to get used to these over time, but if you don't know that you have to have kind of a strong stomach or the ability to build a strong stomach, it's something that a lot of people don't think about. And beyond that, you're going to be sweating, you're going to get mud on you, you're going to get who knows what on you. All you know is that it smells, and that's just par for the course. Even though it's really awesome to be working with these animals, it is not glamorous work at all. And that brings me to my third point. Rehab is really difficult. It's hard emotionally because you're going to be working with animals, the things that you care about most, coming in really bad conditions. Even if you're not working with injured wildlife and you're only taking orphans, you're only getting those animals to begin with because something happened to their mom or their dad, or sometimes both. And those animals are not healthy, often because they haven't been taken care of by a parental figure for some time. It's also really physically exhausting. I liken that working in a wildlife hospital can often be more like working as a field medic than actually working in an animal hospital. Of course, your mileage may vary depending on what organization you're with, but it can be really hard. There's going to be long hours, even if you're just caring for baby animals. Baby songbirds at least need to be cared for pretty much nonstop for 12 hours a day. And for really small neonate animals, sometimes you're only getting 4 hours of sleep, and then you have to wake up, feed them, and then only then do you get to go back to sleep. And finally, rehab is really mentally taxing. You have to retain a lot of information about a lot of different things, and new information is going to be coming out faster than you can digest it sometimes. So if you're a specialist and you're only working with one species, say you only work with Virginia possums, that's a little bit easier to manage because you only have to be an expert on that one species. But most professional rehabbers work at wildlife hospitals where they're working with not just one species, but many. You might be responsible for retaining information about hundreds of animals in their natural history, how to identify them, how to age them, what they eat, things to know about their behavior. There's a lot to know. And even if you're only working with birds, a great blue heron is going to have completely different care needs and requirements than, say, a widgeon is. So overall, even though rehab seems fun, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. The fourth thing that you need to know, and this one's kind of a secret, you don't need a college degree. Okay, you may need a college degree, but you don't necessarily have to have one. So there's a lot of things that goes into this. It is your experience level, it's plain luck, it depends on where you are and what options are available to you. But I know a lot of people that don't have a college degree at all. I remember like in 2016, 2017, I was at a wildlife rehabilitation conference and they had a panel that was basically talking about like demographics of wildlife rehabbers. And the majority of the people in that room had a bachelor's degree. But the majority of the people in that room did not have a degree in biology or wildlife or animal science or anything like that. A lot of them are people that had another degree in a field that made them a lot of money or allowed them the kind of lifestyle that they could rehab on the side. They weren't working in a wildlife hospital or an education facility, although some of them were, but a lot of them were independent rehabbers that, because they had an advanced degree, usually in something that made them relatively well off, at least by most people's standards, they were able to do rehab on the side as a hobby. A lot of these people had some financial independence. Their husband or wife worked a job, but they got to do rehab on the side. And there are no requirements, as far as I'm aware, in any state about what kind of education level that you need to have formally. Some states will require you to pass an exam, which I'll talk about more at some other point, but not all states do. And there's definitely no requirements for you having to have any kind of biology degree. But if you're working at a wildlife hospital, something that has a little bit more funding, isn't just an independent thing, you probably do need some degree, preferably in science. It also depends on what kind of jobs you're looking for in the rehabilitation field as well. And take me, for example. I was working professionally as a rehabber before I got my college degree. The main reason why I went back to school to get my degree was because I wanted to be taken seriously. I had all these ideas on how to make rehab and wildlife science better, but I wasn't being listened to because I didn't have a fancy piece of paper that said I knew things about science or about wildlife, even though I did. There's very few wildlife biologists that are also wildlife rehabbers. That is in part because a lot of people who want to go into wildlife science are not the same sort of people that want to go in rehab, because they are very two different things. So really this comes down to a couple of things. Do you have a lot of experience already? Do you have the money to go to college? Do you have a rehabilitation center that you can volunteer at? Do you want to work at a wildlife hospital? Do you want to work as an independent rehabber where you're not having coworkers, where you're just doing it by yourself? And what kind of financial situation do you have? Is it worth going and getting a bachelor's degree and going into a lot of debt if you're not going to be making a lot of money as a rehabber anyway? I will say that if you want to get a job at an organization, having a degree helps. But if you have a lot of experience, a lot of the times in rehab, experience trumps degrees. I know that when I was hiring, I wanted to see that someone had experience in rehab rather than just having experience with animals, because working in wildlife rehab is so different from all sorts of other animal work. And the last thing I think you need to know is that wildlife rehabilitation is incredibly rewarding, except there's a caveat to that too. Being able to take an injured animal and heal it with your own hands and return it back to the wild is one of the most rewarding things I've ever experienced in my life. It's one of those things that's really hard to describe how it makes you feel until you do it yourself. So even though wildlife rehabilitation can be incredibly difficult, that payoff is amazing. That being said, it's work that often comes with very little pay, very little benefits. Although I have seen a trend in recent years as wildlife rehabilitation has become more professional of some of that changing, but this is still a field where you're not going to get rich. The other thing that's really unfortunate is even though wildlife rehabilitation feels really good to make that difference for that individual animal, both from a rescuer perspective and from the rehabilitator perspective, it is not the way to actually save wildlife on a large scale. The majority of animals that come into wildlife rehab are coming in either indirectly or directly because of people. So for instance, We drive cars. Those cars hit animals. We build houses with windows. Birds have a really hard time understanding what a window is until they crash into it. We really like having pets, which is great, but dogs, and especially cats, cause a lot of harm to our wildlife on such a wide scale that wildlife rehabilitation is actually not addressing the root of the reason why those animals come in to begin with. The other thing too, and again, this is going to depend on your location, in most places, the majority of animals that are coming into rehab are also common species that are relatively doing well. The majority of wildlife rehabilitation facilities are at least somewhat in urban areas where they're getting a lot of animals that can adapt well to urban environments. And though you will get animals that are in decline at your facilities, even I saw endangered and threatened species coming from pretty urban areas. For the most part, you're not making a huge dent in terms of the kind of conservation that matters for the long-term success of species that really need it right now. And that's actually one of the critiques that wildlife rehabbers get from wildlife biologists. And as someone who is both a rehabber and a biologist, I get it. I always describe rehab as you're kind of putting a band-aid on a gaping wound. You're not actually solving the root problem. You're just kind of putting a temporary fix over it for that one animal. Really, if you want to save wildlife on a much larger scale, it's really land management and conservation of declining species that really matters. Virginia opossums are extremely cute, but they're not really declining. And I'm not saying that common animals don't deserve rehabilitation. I think that they do, because common animals are what supports the food web. But it is something to think about, especially if you try to figure out what motivates you to go into this field to begin with. Do you really want to save wildlife on an individual level, or do you want to make a difference on a much larger scale? These are some of the questions you should be asking yourself. And maybe the answer you come to is, yeah, wildlife rehab's not for me. I really care about wildlife, but I think that my talents are better used elsewhere. And if you're asking yourself, well, what careers can I do outside of rehab? Watch this video next.